Hello, thank you for joining. Today we're going to be covering some Anaplan modelling best practices, and the first topic I want to look at is how we deal with time in a flexible way. So as you're probably aware, Anaplan has predefined time settings, which you'll find on the time settings screen within the Anaplan models, and that covers a range of different options we have for different types of calendars. But sometimes flexibility is needed where that pattern doesn't quite fit what we actually need in the business. So we might want to have within a single model some parts of the model that are based on a calendar timescale rather than the fiscal calendar. We might find in weekly patterns where we have 53 weeks that the patterns that the standard pattern of where 53-week occurs every sort of 6 or 7 years doesn't quite fit the way the business wants to reflect those timescales. And similarly, where we have rolling forecasts, we might only want a sort of an 8-week forecast or a 12-week forecast. And to be efficient, we want to try and minimize the amount of calculations that happen within Anaplan. So this demo is going to go through the way of setting that up and also showing you how you can map from the native timescales to a list that we use to represent our more flexible time, how to manage the rolling weekly calendars that we talked about, and how to keep that up to date every year when you want to change from one year to the next, but keeping the rolling weeks going. Also, how you can map from weeks to months where they're different. So fiscal calendars and the way 445 calendars or 544 calendars might fit. You might want to map your data into absolute calendar months rather than the way the native timescale would roll it up. And following on from that, you might want to be really specific about how the actual days get apportioned into weeks, into months. So we'll cover that as well. Okay, so let's have a look at our model we're going to use for the example. And you can see from the calendar type settings we've gone for 445, and we've also chosen a fiscal year, which starts on the 30th of December 2018 and finishes on the 28th of December 2019. And currently, for the purpose of this, we've assumed we're in week number 1. So if we look at this from a setup perspective, if we switch into the application that we're using for this demo, we've assumed that we want 12 weeks as a rolling 12 weeks, so we'll set that up shortly. I've also set the calendar year start to the 1st of January, so we know that effectively the calendar year is starting according to the calendar in Anaplan as the 30th of December, but for the purpose of this, we want to set it as the 1st of January. The other thing to note here is that we've set up time by month module, and you can see that we've entered in the various days of the week, of the days in the month, and made sure that we've got those aligned. This is something that you probably have to do as an annual process. It allows you to account for leap years, and as you'll see when we roll the year over, we need to account for 29 days in February, so we can do that as part of an update process annually. Not a huge amount of maintenance really to deal with. So if we look at the second setup part on the time mappings, you'll see this is now a time by week. So this is our whole week calendar that goes all the way out to 52 weeks. And you can see there's some logic in here. Some of the key formula on the right, we will provide a blueprint copy for you, but essentially the real key areas are we're trying to map this through into the different timescales, and you'll see we don't have at the bottom our more flexible time that we're going to create. So, but we are actually using the same sort of simple logic here, and just using week 1, week 2, week 3. And you would have seen from some of the previous best practices that we don't really want too many concatenations of text and string formations. And if we use the same terminology and the same description, we can actually minimize the amount of text. And also from the user's perspective, where we are being more flexible with time, as far as the users are concerned, it looks the same. It will have the same terminologies as our current timescales. So by all means, change it around if you wanted to do something different, but I tend to prefer to keep the same text so we can just keep it simple and very easy to update. So we've got a very simple process that will essentially just create this fake time, this flexible time from there. So let's just do that and actually just run that through. There is a process that will delete old ones, and we'll come on to that when we do the update process. At this point, there's nothing to do because we haven't got anything. So you'll see now that it appears, and the key line item here is this real weeks one. This essentially is allowing us to map between the two. So Anaplan, as you will probably know, has a block structure underlying it, which is used very much within the timescales for previous is and next and all the time functions. And that allows us on that capability. What it prevents us doing is taking data out using the sum function, and for some of the transformations that we might need to do where we're going back and forth, that's the natural way that we would want to use it. So we use this mapped time module as the conduit between the two. So we can use the sum formula in one sense or the lookup formula on the other sense, depending on what we're looking at from our source to our target. And we're using that real weeks line item there primarily as the key for all of that transformation that we would want to use. So let's have a look at this in terms of what that looks like from an example, now that we've set that up. If we look at the mapping example here, the top module is defined by our normal time, and the bottom module is defined by our mapped time. So as we type information into the top lines, we can just go across and type all the numbers that we would want to see, and you'll see that they appear naturally into the second box. It's just essentially a mapping one way or the other. And conversely, if we want to put some numbers into the bottom box, which is dimensioned by the flexible time, we've mapped those back up to the top box in real time. And referring to what I said before, you'll see that the top one, we're using a sum formula on that line item that I mentioned. And if you look on the second one, we're using the same thing, but we're using a lookup. So essentially, we're using that module as the conduit between the two. So it's kind of sitting between the two and doing the mapping as it needs to. So that's a very, very simple example. And the reason that we wanted to show you that as a simple example is it gives you the structures for anything that you would then want to do around that map time. We're going to look at rolling weeks in a second, but anything that you would need to do where you might want a slightly different setup, understanding the fundamentals of how to map between the native timescale in Anaplan and any other flexible list you want to use. Once you get it set up, it's really simple to just transform that all the way through. So that's why we've used a really simple example to start with. So let's have a look at the rolling weeks that we talked about. We decided we wanted 12 weeks. So at the bottom grid will be dimensioned by the list that we create as 12 weeks. And we're using, again, a module that's dimensioned by week, same sort of formats as before. It's 1 to 12. And because we're counting, you can see that actually we're only counting 12. So we're using a fairly simple logic formula to count for the next 12 weeks from where we are. So we're saying current period forwards. In the first example, we set the current period is week 1, so we want 12 weeks. So in this case, our rolling weeks is 1 to 12, so nice and simple. So again, an action that will clear out the old ones we don't need and then create the new ones. We'll come on to that in the update as well, but effectively at this point, we're just going to create some new ones. So here we go. We have 12 weeks. You'll see there's no scroll bar. This is it. We've got 1 to 12. That's actually a list that's created called rolling weeks. And again, we've got this line item in the middle here. This is the one that really is the key between the two modules again. So using a line item to do the transformation between our native timescale and our rolling weeks timescale works exactly the same way as the one we showed you in the previous example. It's just that this list now only has 12 weeks on it. So let's take a look at that as an example now, how we might use it. So as you can see from the screen here, we've got opening balances and closing balances with some movements in the middle. And at the top of the screen, you'll see I've got an opening balance module that holds it. Often this is how data comes in. And on the previous system mapping modules that we had, I'm flagging whether it's the first period in the week or not. And therefore, we know that we want to bring the 100 into the opening balance. And that's the logic that you'll see on the line item formula. So the middle grid is essentially by our rolling weeks. So this is our list of just 12 items. And the bottom grid, if we look at that, is actually our full list of time that goes all the way out to our 52 weeks. So all we're going to do is use that module we just saw on the previous screen to map the data between the middle grid, bottom grid, and then back again. So from a user perspective, they would only really see this middle grid. So as I type in data into the middle one, you'll see that effectively it flows down into the bottom grid, and I'm taking just the movements. I don't really need any of the individual details. So I just bring the movements down, and that's the one, as you'll see here, that's got the mapping. I'm using the previous functionality that I can use in a native timescale to give me my 700. And then effectively, I just pull that up over here. So I'm not really having to do the work in the main module. So it looks like I've got previous's, but actually I don't. So as I type in figures from a user perspective, it looks like it's flowing. what they're not seeing is the very simple transformation that takes it out, maps it, and puts it back again. So from a user perspective, it's seamless. We're just doing a little bit. And you can obviously use that mapping module for multiple modules and various line items to do various different inputs. So you don't have to have one staging module per, sort of set of modules. You can have a staging module that has multiple line items in it that brings in all the information that you might need from different parts of your model and does all the mapping in one place. What I would say here, though, is if you looked at that bottom module, this is actually going all the way through. And we've only got 1 year in our model at the moment. But if that was a 10-year model or 5-year model, we're doing a lot of calculations that we don't actually need. So we only want 12 weeks here. And yet the calculations you'll see are running all the way through to week 52. And as I said, potentially could go on longer. So what we can do if we want to be really efficient is actually use a bit of a trick using time ranges. So if I switch back to the main model now, I just want to show you what I've set up in the time ranges. So I've set up a time range called rolling 12 weeks, and you'll see that it's got 12 periods in it, but note that I've made it start on the 31st of December 2000, so it's FY01. And the reason I've done that, as you'll see in a second, is I kind of just want to keep it simple, and so that we know that we are effectively trying to use this as a proxy to mirror the rolling weeks. FY01 effectively equates to the first year or first week of our rolling weeks timescale. So it's a kind of almost setting up a 1 to 12. And by using FY01, then we've got FY01 to FY12. Obviously, you can choose however you want to map these, but I just think it's quite simple, keeps it easy. Don't have to worry too much about the labeling. It also helps when we come to set it up, as you'll see on the screen now. When we go to the setup for the time ranges, I'm using the same logic. We know that week 1 is going to equate to year 1. So again, it's minimizing the amount of manipulation we have to do to get this to match, because when we're creating these buttons that create the options or the matches or with the find item, we want to try and obviously have to use a text to find it. We want to minimize that. So the only bit of logic in here is really just to look at, is it a single character or is it one character, 2 characters, and therefore do a very small piece of logic. And notice there's not a lot of text joining I need to do. I don't have to be trying to pull information out of the middle of a week 1 or something like that, because we're just using a counter that says 1 to 12. And again, you'll see down the bottom here, we've got a mapping that says, this is my time range. So I'm mapping my weeks to my time range. So I'm effectively, my list that says 1 to 12 is now mapped to a year. And the reason that we've done that is just to be totally optimal on our calculation. Is, if you remember from previously, we were doing that calculation for 52 weeks, whereas really we only wanted to do it for 12. So if you look at from the same data now, it looks exactly the same from a user's perspective. So I'm going to put in some growths here. I can put in some disposals here again. It's flowing the same way, exactly the same, but it's only now doing the calculations for 12 weeks, for 12 years. So we don't have this running a long time in the future, doing lots of calculations. We don't have to put any logic in place to sort of say, if I get to the end of my rolling week, stop doing the calculations. All stuff that would just add to the complexity. So keeping it really simple, and all we're doing is just mapping between the two. So nice and easy, really kind of efficient way of optimizing how we might do a rolling timescale with opening and closing balances. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more complicated. So if we look at what we're trying to do next is, if you remember from the beginning, we said that actually the timescales that is set up in the calendar, because it's a fiscal calendar, it starts in a different month and year to where we really need it. So if we look at this going through, you'll see the way that the 445 calendar naturally works. If we look at week 5, you can see that it actually starts in January and finishes in February. But because the way the calendar is set up, and this is normal within businesses, you don't have a natural match between the week and the month. So normally, as you can see from the month mapping here, this is where it will roll up. And any date that comes into Anaplan, any imports, any logic, it knows that the 28th of January will fall into the February timescale because that's the way it's been set up. So maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we actually want to have, in this case, the 5th week being included into January. So all we need to do is just copy that around. We can take January and put it into there. And you see I've added a little bit of conditional formatting on here so that the users or the admins can see where we've overridden the natural mapping. So let's have a look at how that looks on our mapping examples. So we'll have a look at our weeks to months example. And I'm going to switch this to EMEA just because I want to show the data flowing through. So I'm going to just set up 7 across here, and the reason I'm going to do that will be apparent in a second, but I just want to put 7 into every single week. And if you look at the middle section now, if we ignore the prorated one for a minute, we're going to come back to that shortly. If we look at the natural roll-up, you can see it's following a 4-4-5 pattern because it's putting 4 weeks, i.e. 7 days, so 28 days, into the first 4 weeks, then 35. So you can see it's following that 4-4-5 pattern all the way through. Whereas actually now, because of the way we've mapped it, and the validity of this is purely from an example, you can see that we've got 35 days in January and only 21 in February. That's because we mapped that through and said the middle 3 weeks of our timescale from Anaplan was February, but the first week of it I wanted to go into January. So obviously any data that goes in there will be mapped. I'm just showing 7 days to show the logic. So that's a simple way of doing it if you want the whole weeks. So we want the whole of a week to go into a 1 month or the other month, and you can just manually map that yourself. Maybe you've got a calendar yourself you can import, or even if you needed to, you could build in some logic to do the calculations for you. But what if we want to be really sophisticated? So let's look at this example here where we actually want to say, well, I kind of need to be more scientific than that. Just having a whole week move either way isn't really very, very clever. What I really want to do is to say, well, let me take the numbers of days that are in the wrong place. So if we look at the example here, we know that the first week started on the 30th of December. So there were 2 days that really don't belong in week 1. So week 1 for our calendar year is only 5 days worth. And week 5, we've got 5 days that really belong to January and 2 days in February. And you can see as you go through, it changes. So we've got a similar pattern in week 9. We've got a similar pattern in week 14 where the dates don't quite align with the months. So there are various combinations of this, and this example might not cover all of your nuances and all of the calculations. And in setting this up, tried to build the logic to say, well, maybe sometimes it goes into next month. The examples I was using didn't have that, but this is a way you can do the logic, and you can come up with any logic that you want to just apportion it. The important thing is that you build this module out to do the logic to work out what the percentages are. And then essentially, when we come to do the mapping, we are then going to just work out which bits of data go into which month. So if you look at the example that we showed previously, if you look at the bottom part, this is essentially where the calculations are coming through. So my data is coming through in 7s, and I'm actually saying, well, how much of it goes into the previous month? And it's just pulling that percentage through. So you can see that I've got a 2 and a 5 there, and then I've got a 5 and a 2 there. So then if you look at the middle grid, you'll see now I'm actually getting exactly the right numbers of days. And again, because I'm using 7, it's easier to see that. But obviously, as you change that with any other number, it would work efficiently all the way through. So that gives you complete control over how you want to look at your weekly data. How do you want to allocate it up into a month? You can use natural Anaplan, which will be 4-4-5. You could use a manually mapped one, which we can see in the middle example. Or you could do the scientific way of prorating, and what you could use any logic of that basis. You might want to use some daily profile that you brought in before. I just went with a simple numbers of days in the week and divided by a month type of calculation going on there. Okay, so now let's switch back to the model itself, and wanted to show you how once we've set this up, it's very easy now to keep going and update this through your planning cycles. So let's assume that we're now going to move on to week 5. So instead of being in week 1, we're in week 5. So this would be changed in the model. So now if we go back to our application and just have a look at the mappings, you'll see when we go to the rolling week setup, so we haven't changed the year, so we don't have to worry about the year being set up. That's still the same thing. When we look in here, you can now see that our counter of where the first of our rolling week starts is now week 5. So instead of starting at week 1, it's now week 5. And you can see that my counter now goes across, so it goes out to week 16. So it's adjusted the knowledge of where my rolling weeks start and finish. What we haven't yet done is updated the list. So you can see at the bottom, we're still on week 1 to 12, which is wrong. So it's really weeks 1 to 4 shouldn't exist anymore, and we need to add them up. So that was the reason I had the delete process. So if you look at the bottom of this grid, you'll see those 4 items there now have a delete flag. So the first part of the process will be to take out weeks 1 to 4 and then essentially update the rest. So let's do that and just show you that this is automatic. So if I look at the steps now, you can see one was to delete it and the other was to build the new ones. So essentially, we're just going to update it, run the 2 steps, and now you'll see that the bottom grid completely updates. So nothing else. There's no manual entries needed here. This is completely automatic. So every time you go in and change, everything is now as it was before. And the same principle applies now with everything that we were looking at. So in our rolling weeks with our opening closing balance example, you can see that if we look at America again, just so we're at the same place we were at before, the data's disappeared from we were looking at weeks 1 to 4. Any data that existed in weeks 5 to 12 will still be there because we haven't changed anything, but the logic still works. Nothing's changed, same principles. Obviously, if there was any data that you wanted to keep for various reasons, you could move that around as part of the process beforehand. But here we've assumed that we don't need to worry about weeks 1 to 4 anymore. You could easily map that or do another process if you needed to. So really, really simple to set that up. And the same principle applies when we look at our setup for our time ranges. You'll see essentially, because this is the bottom grid on the rolling weeks, we've just mapped week 5 to the first of our time ranges. So we don't have to add or delete or change anything on our time ranges. We've just mapped the first week, which is week 5. So we're keeping the same logic applied. We've just shifted everything over so that week 5 is now equivalent to the first week of our time range. And the same applies if we look at the example. Nothing's changed there. The logic's still exactly the same. It's just our time range is the same at the bottom. We've just got weeks 5 to week 16 at the top. Okay, so the final piece now will be, well, what happens at the end of a year? So let's go back into the model and let's move this over. So now we're going to move to fiscal year 20. And you can see this is now again different. It's 29th of December to the 26th of December 2020. It's actually a leap year as well, so that's interesting for us to deal with. So we update the time scale, and I'm going to set this to just to week 1 because we're at the beginning of the year. So again, let's flick back and have a look at what that means. So a lot of our information now is going to be out of date, but from a setup perspective, it really isn't that onerous to do. And again, some of this could be imported from a data hub. We're still looking at 12 weeks. We haven't changed our thinking about how many weeks we want. Our startup calendar is now wrong, obviously. We want to increment that. So we're going to increment that to the 1st of January. And you'll also see that our days in our months are wrong. So again, this could come from an import if you had something already, or you can essentially just put that information in. As I said, it really doesn't take you too long to work out, or to update this. It's a once a year process. I can put the right one. Then, so that's it. That's our setup done. So we now have to update the mappings that we had, because essentially we're still looking at week 1 FY19. So that's wrong, obviously. As you can see on the top grid here, we can't find week 1 FY20 in our list because it's not there. So again, very simple process. Let's just delete the old ones and bring in the new ones. So there we go. Everything's mapped in. That's fine. Similarly, if we now look at our rolling weeks setup, again, same thing. We're still looking at week 5 to week 16, and we hadn't changed it from the previous time. That's obviously wrong. So we just want a very simple process. And there you go. Week 1 is now mapped in. All the mappings are correct. So everything will work. So logic's exactly the same as we saw before. So if we look at the mapping examples, let's have a look at the simple mappings. Obviously no data in there, but we're now week 120 to week 120. So as we type in figures across there, you can see they flow through. And as we type figures in here, you'll see they flow back up the top. So again, we're not changing any logic. The logic is already built in. Our rolling weeks with opening closings, as before, the 100 goes to the first week because this obviously would now come in and be a different value because it's a different year. Same logic applies. No, nothing changes. The logic all works as per normal. Exactly the same with the time ranges. Again, just to prove it out, it's doing exactly the same logic as we had before. And now let's look at our weeks to months, because this one's interesting because particularly around the leap year side of things. Let me just switch that to EMEA because that was our 7 days. And let's put my 7s back in because it was easier to use for 7. So I'll just copy that over across because it'll be quicker. So let's go back at our setup and see what we want to do. Now, obviously, if you remember before, we decided what we wanted, where weeks were going to fall. So at the moment, that's something else that I need to do. Again, for the purpose of this, I'm just going to go back and say, well, let's actually make everything natural. Same thing applies as we did previously. I might just decide that I do want that one to be into there. So that's as I had before. I'm not changed my mind. But let's look at the more detailed calculation one. And this is interesting because we've now got 3 days at shift. Week 5, it's almost on the borderline. And then you look at further over and you can see February's getting closer. And the interesting thing on here is when we actually go all the way across, because of the way it works, week 22 is actually entirely in May. Yet the way the 445 calendar works out, that actually puts it into the wrong month. So you can see we've actually got a whole of a week that we want to move in 1 week to a month here. Again, we don't have to worry about that. That's just the way that the logic has come out. So everything is mapped properly. So when we come to actually look at our examples of our weeks to months, you can see we've got the same sort of logic that we had before, 29 now, because we know that it's 29 days in February. So all the apportionment done. So once you set it up, and once you get the logic right from the beginning, I'm sure you'll agree that annual maintenance was a really, how long did that take? A minute, if that? And you could probably automate even more steps of that if you really needed to from other source systems or data hubs if you needed to. So hopefully that's given you a really good example of how we actually map from our native timescales, which provide some really good functionality and allow you to have the flexibility that you need within your businesses to really model out and be really efficient and give the users a efficient calculation, but also really intuitive experience, only really giving them what they need.